Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Peterson Institute for International Economics. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute, and it's a great pleasure today that we are looking at something a little below the surface, but of profound importance, which is how and why wages get set where they do for low-wage workers in the U.S. and in a global context. If I can speak for a moment leading into our panel and then our guest speaker later, thanks to a series of major grants from the Aranda Foundation, the Peterson Institute has been working on inequality and inclusive capitalism for a while. We did not get there first and most with the inequality bestseller, but we have been doing substantial work around the issues, particularly of comparative labor market and comparative financing across countries, and how this affects outcomes for actual people. Our basic premise, which I hope today and all our guest speakers I know will reflect, is that when you start talking about inequality or exclusion, the tendency is to be like farmers talking about the weather. You sort of say it's bad and then just accept that that's the way it is. Or you rail against the weather and go off onto crazy fixes. Our commitment in our project, and I believe of everyone here today, is to say, okay, we may not be able to affect the weather, but we can differentially come up with roofs, appropriate drainage, gutter cleaning, and maybe even proper redistribution of water rights, if we're really going to push it. So it's in that spirit we've seized upon this issue of wage increases. Now, obviously, there is a macroeconomic background. This gives me a chance to plug that tomorrow we will be having our semi-annual Global Economic Prospects here in this room at noon under the leadership of David Stockton talking about the U.S. economy, Nick Lardy talking about China, and Preston to double duty, one of our speakers today, Jacob Kierkegaard on Europe. So there is this macro background that as the U.S. economy improves, we do expect wages to pick up, but there is something more at work here. There is something more at work in terms of some of the actions taken by American companies. We're going to be featuring later today the CEO of Aetna, Mark Bertolini, who took a real initiative in this position, but also fundamentally that the labor share of the economy is at close to an all-time low from the post-war period. And that's a number that generally never used to fluctuate very much over the business cycle and has been sustained at a lower share of national income for many years now. And the question is, does it have to be that way? When does it make sense for companies to change that? And that's what we're going to address today. We're very fortunate to be releasing a set of short papers in our new briefing series, which we put together, meant to be very topical and pointed. And two of the contributing authors will be speaking today. My colleague Justin Wolfers, who is a Speak First, is a senior fellow here and is on leave from the University of Michigan, where he's a professor of economics and public policy. He's, of course, also a rock star on Twitter, columnist for the New York Times, a man who runs ridiculous numbers of marathons, and someone who has importantly forced us to up our game here on micro and labor issues, which was why we brought him over, and we're delighted to have him with us. Speaking second will be the aforementioned Jacob von Kierkegaard, who's been associated with the Institute since 2002. We are immensely proud of Jacob, who has grown up into being double threat, the leading American commentator and forecaster in many ways of the political economy of Europe, which we'll return to tomorrow. But for today, and as exemplified not just by his work in our new briefing on wages, but his recent working paper, someone who sees the connections and comparisons across labor markets and pension schemes around the world. And it's great to have him contributing substantively to that discussion. I'm also grateful that because of the importance of this discussion and our friendship with various actors in the public debate, we have with us today two other speakers. Damon Silvers, who is the Director of Policy and Special Counsel for the AFL-CIO, we think of him as Mr. Substance for the AFL. That wasn't meant as a swipe. That was meant as a positive thing for Damon. Sorry. He's done an incredible number of things. He remains a Special Assistant Attorney General pro bono for the state of New York. He's a member of the Investor Advisory Committee of the SEC, the Treasury Department's Financial Research Advisory Committee, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board Standing Advisory Group. He was Deputy Chair of the Congressional Oversight Panel for TARP from 2008 to 2011, so covers a whole range of economic, regulatory, and financial issues, and has done so from a very strong public service perspective. And previously, from 2006 to 2008, was chair of the Competition Subcommittee of the U.S. Treasury's Advisory Committee on the Auditing Profession. We're putting him back into more labor camp today, but I'm sure he can handle that. And then finally, speaking on our panel will be Michael Strain, who recently was named Deputy Director for Economic Policy Studies and has long been a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. So to give him the similar sort of thing, he is the economist at AEI who probably most of us read most. Michael is well known for taking iconoclastic views motivated by substance and principle, not by press, but he manages to get himself in the press quite a bit nonetheless, and is a contributor to the Washington Post. Has previously done extensive real research with the Labor Dynamics Institute, with the U.S. Census Bureau, the New York Census Research Center, and will be giving us an additional perspective on today's issues. So thank you all very much for joining us, and I'd like to first call up Justin Wolfers, please.
My task here is simple. What I want to do is make the case that there's a legitimate business case to be made for employers to be paying higher wages than they currently do, and I think that case is particularly strong at the lower end of the labour market. And I want to be clear that what I want to talk about is microeconomics, not macroeconomics. So this is not, it was widely attributed to Henry Ford that he started paying his workers $5 a day so that they could all afford to buy Ford cars. This seems like a tremendously inefficient way to generate demand for Ford cars. So it's not the Keynesian argument, and in fact it wasn't the Keynesian argument for Henry Ford either. Instead it's the claim that when you treat your workers well, when you treat them fairly, then they'll work harder, they'll work longer, they'll stay with you, and there are potentially cost savings. In fact, there are potentially real profit opportunities from doing this. The Ford plant at the time employed 14,000 men on the line making cars, but in order to keep 14,000 men on the line, they had to hire 52,000 people every year. You can see how turnover costs like that can really undermine a business's efficiency, and so therefore the case for paying a little more, making staying on the line a little more attractive, might actually yield real benefits. So the argument then is that you pay a little more, you get a little better. And this is by no means a new argument. We economists refer to it generally under the rubric of efficiency wage theory. It's a theory, like all great economic theories, that was first surfaced in Marshall. And later on, in fact, some of its most important champions were our current Fed chair, Janet Yellen, and her husband and Nobel Prize winner, George Akerlof. And the arguments go like this. Because we're economists, we always think about, things in terms of incentives. The claim is, if we're paying you better in your current job, you value being in your current job more. And if that's the case, then you want to make sure, you want to minimize the possibility that you'll lose that job. By that logic, you'll work harder. And so that's sort of the mean-spirited version, the no-shirking version of the claim that what you want to do is pay your workers a little more. The empirical research on this has actually been quite useful, but it's come up with a bunch of very different margins than necessarily what we write down in our economic models. One of the obvious things is if you pay a little more, you're likely to get higher quality workers come to your firm. if you think about what's happening at the present moment, we're at a very interesting moment right now with McDonald's and Walmart and Aetna and the like, all suggesting that they're willing to pay higher wages. And I think there's actually a real first mover advantage to those firms. There are a bunch of low-skilled workers who would much rather earn $10 an hour than $8 an hour. My guess is that many of those workers are going to Aetna rather than their competitors. There's a doubly strong argument when it comes to firms that are involved in customer service. Customer service means actually knowing about and identifying with what it is your customers want. If you're more or less paying your workers so that they're part of a completely separate society where they can't afford to be a part of or engage in the same sorts of activities as your customers, they may simply not understand it. So again, to take a firm like Aetna, Aetna is moving towards a lot more having folks on the phone dealing with customers' inquiries. Well, if you want someone to deal with your health insurance inquiry, it probably makes a lot more sense for it to be someone who actually knows what health insurance is, who understands the difficulties of dealing with bureaucracies over these things, and actually can identify and be a part of what it is that the customers are calling about. Otherwise, the whole thing gets a real sense of being in a different language, and we've all had those frustrating moments with phone call service centres where it feels like the person on the other end of the line has no idea what we're talking about. In some cases, it's because they don't. They're not living the same life that you and I may be. The dimension which I think resonates most clearly with our economic models, which are about trying to prevent shirking, as it turns out that firms that pay higher wages typically have fewer disciplinary problems. And there I think the logic is completely obvious. Why is it that we behave ourselves at work? For some of us it's innate professionalism, but for others it's because we value our job. And we value the job more the better that we're treated. Absenteeism, it's easy to show that, and a variety of studies have shown absenteeism tends to be lower in workplaces with higher pay. Now, we've actually, a lot of the studies, in fact, and a lot of the better evidence focuses on two margins. One is absenteeism, and the other is turnover. And the reasons for that, I think, are not necessarily that these are the most far-reaching, interesting, or important margins, but rather those that are easiest for us economists to measure. But it turns out that turnover is overwhelmingly the most studied margin, and and there are a large number of studies showing that the higher the wages within a workplace, the better the workers feel treated, the more likely they are to stay. So job turnover tends to fall, job tenure tends to be greater, therefore people's learning on the job and sets of skills tend to develop better as well. So that's the stuff that I think economists have done a very good job at measuring. I think there's a whole other realm of stuff that really matters that we simply can't measure as well. And usually when we write down these models, we think about it's really important to pay workers well, so they're thinking about how they're doing relative to their outside options. But actually, sometimes it's just important to treat people fairly, and a sense of being treated fairly, which is not necessarily a cold calculating ratio of an existing wage to an outside offer, but it's a general sense of how you feel treated could really matter. And I think if you look at, there's no shortage of firms that have, I think, dysfunctional cultures of conflict between workers and management, between labour and capital, and a lot of that dysfunctionality comes back to a sense of not being treated fairly, which in turn has something to do with how workers are treated. There's also a real sense that when workers are treated well and are paid fairly, management gains a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of workers. And again, you can think about different firms that you've been in. I know upstairs, if I want to go to the stationery closet right now, I feel treated very fairly by the Peterson Institution. I do not. If I go upstairs to the stationery closet, if I wanted to, I could take out 200 pads of lined paper. And my 5-year-old who likes to draw might really like that. But I don't do it. And I don't do it because this is an institution that I regard as having a great deal of legitimacy. I should also say there's another reason I don't do it. I don't do it because if I was seen walking out the front door with 200 pads of paper right now, one of my colleagues who believes that the institution has a great deal of legitimacy may go and talk to Adam about it. And so one of the things you get is when an institution has legitimacy and is perceived to have legitimacy, workers tend to monitor themselves and they monitor each other. Now you can compare this to any number of low-wage workplaces you may have gone to visit, where you have to actually go up to someone behind the counter and demand 3 pads of lined paper, and they'll ask you why and which account number to charge it to. What you have instead often is, instead of this sense of generalized trust and fairness, you actually have to put in extra monitoring and extra supervision. You have to do that because the institution's not seen as legitimate, so I feel more comfortable stealing. I feel more comfortable being slack on the job. And the other thing is my fellow workers don't have a shared interest in the broader institution's greater goals. And I think this legitimacy thing really matters. And one of the things you do see is when you look across companies, the higher the wages, the fewer the supervisors involved. Now, hiring extra supervisors and extra people to monitor, which is not a productive activity, is incredibly expensive. So buying this sense of legitimacy is something that's very important that you can buy with higher wages. The original forms of efficiency wage theory actually started off by talking about health. And were we thinking about the developing world, we'd be talking about, you know, for sure there are villages where people simply don't eat enough to be at their full level of productivity. Now, it's very hard to make the case that in the US we should raise wages so that people can get enough calories to get through the day. In fact, our bigger problem in the US appears to be we have a few too many calories. But I think there are still important versions in which health actually really does matter, and that lower wages can be a real impairment. One of the most interesting avenues of research right now is in psychology, thinking about people's psychological burdens and how they deal with them. And one of the things that we're learning, and Eldar Shafir and Sendhil Mullainathan have written a book called Scarcity about this, is that being poor is incredibly stressful. And stress puts a greater cognitive load on you. And the greater the cognitive load that you're bearing as you go to work, the less room that you have to make good decisions when you're in the workplace. So one of my favorite experiments, it's a very simple experiment, they go to a local shopping center and they take a bunch of people and they say, they have them do a little test, right? And most people do pretty well on the test. One way to make people do badly on the test is before you administer the test, say, I want you to think about your car just broke down and you have about $1,500 worth of repairs to make to your car. It turns out when you take poor people and you ask them to think about $1,500 worth of mythical repairs to a mythical car in a shopping centre, they then do much worse on the test. When you take rich people and do the same thing, they're like $1,500, that's fine, they get on with their lives. Now, the way to think about this, of course, is that the test here is a stand-in for your performance on the job. That the greater cognitive load of poverty may lead people to make systematically bad decisions on the job. You can see how this is there's a rich vein of research here for psychologists. It's much harder for economists to get at this. But the idea that there are workers who make bad decisions, and we can list some of them, right? We see people who can't afford to smoking. They've spent all day trying to keep their shit together. That's an Australian technical term. And at the end of the day, just don't have the self-control left. And in much the same way they may be making mistakes by picking up a pack of smokes, they're likely making mistakes with some of the decisions that they're making on the line as well. So, you know, the first claim that I wanted to make here is simply that there's very strong reasons to believe that paying low-wage workers well may actually be profitable for companies. And, you know, that literature, I think, gives us some sense and some flavour of what that's like. Of course, that's not an argument that goes everywhere for every firm, and you know, the more that it involves, the greater your turnover costs are, the more attractive that argument's going to be. The more possibility there is for conflict between workers and management, the more important that supervision is. The more important that dealing with customers and customer services, the more compelling that argument's going to be. The second claim I want to make is that the argument that we should pay some workers a little better, which at first, coming from an economist, sounds completely bizarre and sounds like something from outside the tribe and sounds incredibly radical, is in fact the least radical claim that you could possibly make. If you look at most firms out there, most firms pay workers more than they have to. In fact, very few people in the US labour force are paid according to the federal on the federal minimum wage. So with this idea, this insight that you should pay people a little better and hope for a little more is one that in fact almost every manager out there already understands. The third question that I want to raise is this all relative? So maybe some of this is about, you know, if you can get your firm, pay your workers a little more, what matters is paying your workers more relative to other workers. And so this is something that might work for one firm, but it wouldn't work for the whole economy. So in the jargon we prefer to use, this might work in partial equilibrium, but not general equilibrium. And I think it really depends. It's not entirely obvious. So the first thing is, remember, in our models, our technical models, which we can write down, what a worker cares about is their wage in this job relative to their outside option. In reality, what a lot of us care about is being treated well and being treated fairly. And so maybe it's not just about relativities. A second observation is at the present historic moment, the outside option for many workers is not would I be better off working at Walmart or Kmart, it's would I be better off working at Walmart or being unemployed. So the relevant relativity is not between firms, but actually between work and not work. And if that's the case, it's no longer a question that it's all just relative. And I think the other point that I want to make is that many of the pathways we can think about are not actually about relativities. And again, I want to come back and think about things like legitimacy or the psychological evidence on cognitive load and the cognitive load of being poor. Being poor is actually, being poor is not a purely relative thing. And so struggling to make ends meet, I think, probably does undermine the productivity of many, many workers. And if you read ethnographies of the American poor, they're absolutely full of examples of someone who had a reasonably good job, then their car broke down, and they had no way of getting back to work the next day. And that in turn led them to get fired and yields an even worse looking resume for the next job that they happen to apply for. So there are real issues of can I get reliable transport to work? Can I get reliable childcare? Am I worried about my paycheck running out at the end of the month? These are things that I think very much depend more on absolutes than on relatives, in which case there is reason to believe that if other firms also were to raise their lower wages, that they too could get real productivity gains. So the argument here is very much the way an economist would describe it as one of there being two equilibria. You can pay your workers not very much and get not very much, or you can pay them a fair bit more and get a fair bit more. And if the offset is about 1 for 1, then either of those is going to be roughly equally profitable. And so then it becomes a question for a CEO, which of those two choices do I want to make? And obviously you might think that one has more positive, broader implications than the other. Now, it's very difficult, the important thing I would say is it's very difficult to know exactly what the offset is. So I have spent a lot of time reading just about every case study that we're aware of firms who've decided to take the high road and seen what sorts of payoffs they get, and firms that have decided to take the low road. I've also spent time talking to HR executives about how they think about these choices. And it turns out we're really good at quantifying small things and really bad at quantifying big things. So as I said, we can usually measure pretty well what the turnover consequences are of higher wages, but things like legitimacy and fairness and the broader productivity payoffs are invariably incredibly badly measured. We think they're there, we don't know whether they yield a 50% return to the employer, a 100% return, or a 200% return. And the thing that I'm struck by when I talk to the HR executives who are making many of these decisions is that they're fogged in by as much uncertainty as we are. So there may be a knee-jerk instinct among some to think that the right thing to do is always to keep wages as low as possible, but I think there's a very real possibility that's actually worth exploring what higher wages look like and what sorts of payoffs one can get. There is no example in the literature, and if I could ask a CEO to do this, of course I would, and their workers would hate me for it. I would love to see a CEO take half their plants, offer half their plants higher wages, leave the other half down in the doldrums, and monitor the hell out of both groups. Then they would know whether this was a good or a bad situation. But the truth is that no CEO has ever run that experiment, and therefore any CEO who's choosing either the high or the low road is doing so through an enormous fog of uncertainty. Given that uncertainty, I think there's every reason to believe that there's good reasons for firms to be experimenting a little more. It's just a different management practice, but it's one that potentially has a really big payoff. Let me stop there.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today to talk about these issues, and it's obviously also always great to follow Justin. And I figured I should perhaps try to say a little bit about the macroeconomic setting that the microeconomic dynamics that Justin talked about operates in, and then a little bit about sort of the broader political situation where I would argue there's also some issues. But I think first and foremost is also, from a research perspective, this is a very nice subject to work on right now, because we are in this sort of analytical gray area between anecdotes and a clear trend when we look at what's going on with self-initiated corporate initiatives in the United States. It can either become a dominant national trend or it can fizzle away. And I think it's fair to say that we certainly, when we think about it here at the Peterson Institute, would like it to spread as a wildfire. But I think also we should recognize that this may not be entirely or as straightforward for some corporates as it is for others, and there are some objective analytics for each firms, and we try to do that, just dig into which type of firms made this type of initiative, whether it is higher wages or some of the other initiatives we have seen recently from Microsoft and others compelling their contractors to pay sick leave and other things, whether or not they would be more appropriate for some firms, some sectors, and for others. This is obviously very important when you think about what is the true extent that these types of initiatives can reach with respect to the share of the total US labor force and others. But I think it's fair to say that, in my opinion at least, there is basically there is a broader set of macroeconomic issues and a broader set of political issues in which these trends are being played out right now. On the macroeconomic front, I think it's fair to say that the macroeconomic logic that Justin just laid out is probably more effective when you are in a labor market like we have in the United States that is objectively tightening. There may be quite likely more of a first mover advantage for individual firms in this situation than in a period where there is an abundance of unemployed workers. And it may even be that if we are in a situation, as we find ourselves in the United States today, where perhaps the real hurdle is luring people from the ranks of the outside the labor force back into the labor force, irrespective of their skill level, it's actually perhaps an even better point in time to raise wages, because I think there's quite a lot of analytical results which will show that one of the things that really, or perhaps the most important thing that lures people back into the labor force is actually higher wages. There is also perhaps a situation from the corporate side where I think it's fair to say that the marginal benefit for corporations for doing all the other things with their cash on hand is perhaps declining at the moment. We know for a fact that there has been low levels of investment, broadly speaking, from corporations. Perhaps we are at a level where the stock market is such that mergers and acquisitions are no longer as attractive as they were. And therefore, the lack of alternative, and perhaps it's even the low interest rate environment that does it. That basically now, in a country where there is little institutional pressure for higher wages, corporations simply find in a situation where, because of declining returns of these other avenues of deploying their capital, it actually makes sense right now to pay their workers more. And that, of course, is a fairly not very benign interpretation of the situation. But I think perhaps also there is a broader political setting in which the recent trend is occurring in. And I think if we think about it, if we look at most of the polling, it's very clear that income inequality and poverty issues have become an increasing concern to the public in the United States. And I think it's also fair to say that right at this moment, there is little legislative likelihood of things improving, at least at the national level. But I think, ironically, it's also very important to recognize, and Justin mentioned this to me when we were talking about this event last week, that actually this is an area in which there has been a lot of executive branch action taken, quite in the same trend as what many corporations is doing, because if you think about what Barack Obama, the CEO, mentioned last year in his State of the Union speech, it was in fact that he mandated through executive order that the contractors of federal government pay $10 an hour. So in that sense, one could even make the argument that the subsequent corporate action was actually mimicked on some of the corporate action that the CEO, Barack Obama, took earlier. And we have subsequently seen this year in which the call was for the workers or for federal contractors to pay sick leave. Well, that has subsequently picked up by Microsoft. But basically, I would argue that we are in a situation that where, because of the lack of likely legislative action by Congress on this issue and the rising level of public anxiety of this issue, there really is an opportunity for a corporation to get a significant PR benefit from doing this. Basically appearing to have become a responsible stakeholder at this very point in time. And I would also perhaps go further and say that it's kind of a little bit like the previous and well-known model for affecting corporate behavior that we have seen, when we're talking about sweatshop laborers in the third world and the likes. The dynamics is a little different, but it's certainly a very American and private sector-led initiative to drive this. Yet, the interesting thing here, of course, is that it is not, in fact, labor standards in the third world that are being addressed, but it is actually perceived deficiency in the labor standards and wage levels of workers, or some workers at least, in the United States. Which, of course, means that when you then look at the US labor legislation code and you see, well, the United States is quite unique among the OECD countries in, for instance, having no legislated parental leave on the books. It obviously, as was highlighted in the last State of the Union, doesn't have mandated sick leave either. And then you think about, well, where is the next step of this type of pressures going to be found? Well, I would say that these are probably the next steps for which these types of corporate actions will be taken. And as I said, it basically means that we are, in my opinion, in a very fortuitous, both macroeconomic but also broadly political situation right now. So I think what we're seeing is, from that perspective, certainly very welcome, and it has an opportunity to actually be taken quite a lot further into other initiatives and other areas of labor standards, not just wages. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. This is a wonderful conference, and thank you, Adam, for including the loyal opposition. It's a pleasure to be here. The discussion today is about voluntary wage increases for lower wage workers. I will take voluntary to mean non-legislated, that a firm is responding to market pressures rather than to legislations or executive decrees. And I will discuss voluntary wage increases as they relate to federal minimum wage legislation and to the living wage movement. So a little different spin than we've heard. But first, let me say that I welcome voluntary wage increases for lower wage workers. I welcome a situation where firms are responding to market pressures and are raising the wages of low wage workers. I think in this discussion it can get kind of technical, and I think that sometimes people sound like they're defending low wages, and that's not something that we should be defending. We should be defending appropriate wages. This signals very good news for the macroeconomy. It signals very good news for the labor market. It would add evidence in support of the hypothesis that the labor market is tightening, which is something that we should all want. And very importantly, it is very good for low-wage workers themselves, who should be our primary concern, Many of them have trouble making ends meet. Justin did a great job talking about issues of cognitive load and of the stress that having financial problems can lead to a person. That helps make them, that pushes them in the direction, in some cases, of being a bad worker. But it also pushes them in other directions that are bad as well in their personal lives. And so we should be very happy when some of those pressures are alleviated. These workers are playing by the rules. They have jobs, so they're working hard. Getting a pay increase is a fantastic development for them. We should all be happy about it. So I will now turn to the main focus of my remarks, which is voluntary wage increases in the context of public policy. And I'll just make three points. The first is that, according to press reports, average wages, even after these voluntary wage increases, average wages among firms in industries that disproportionately employ low-wage workers will still be lower than the desired federal minimum wage of the president and congressional Democrats. This is a little hazy because not all the data is out there, but my understanding is that the firms in these industries that have announced voluntary increases so far will be under $10.10 an hour. McDonald's, for example, promises to pay an average of $10 an hour for some of their firms, which is less than the $10.10 an hour that many on the left desire. My understanding, based on press reports also, is that this is true for Walmart. It may not be true for some firms that have a broader distribution of wages within their firm, but it is true, and Jacob, I think, makes the correct point that industries matter, and it is true, or seems at least to be true at this point, in firms who are in industries that are thought of as disproportionately paying low wages and hiring low-wage workers. And of course, it's far short of the living wage movement's call for a mandatory $15 per hour minimum. It's far short of the wages that some municipalities, perhaps most famously Seattle, are putting in place for their firms as well. So this says to me that $10.10 an hour is likely too high for a federal minimum wage. Those few firms who are publicly announcing pay increases are still below what the president and congressional liberals would require the minimum to be for all firms. And so we need to keep that in mind when trying to map discussion of these voluntary pay increases into our discussion about national public policy. And again, this says to me that $15 per hour, which some municipalities are moving towards and which the living wage movement wants, is way too high. The second point that I would make is that these voluntary increases do not justify raising the federal minimum wage. It is an empirical fact that wages are mysterious. Justin did a fantastic job, I think, of walking through the microeconomics of why wage increases make sense in many cases, and how in many cases those empirical realities are either not the main focus of economic theory or are missing entirely. It is also a fact that standard econometric techniques can explain only a fraction of the variation in wages. But to me, those facts suggest that we proceed with caution about policies that may result in significant employment losses among lesser skilled and vulnerable Americans. To listen to many on the left, you would think that what I just said is a fringe view, but in fact, I don't think it is. The Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, which is the referee for so many of our public policy debates, recently reported that raising the federal minimum wage to $10.10 per hour could result in hundreds of thousands fewer low-wage jobs. The CBO also reported that a $10.10 per hour federal minimum would result in $31 billion of increased earnings for low-wage workers. This sounds good, but if you dig a little deeper, the CBO found that only 19%, less than 4 out of every $5, of that $31 billion would accrue to families below the poverty line, whereas 1/3 of the $31 billion would accrue to families earning more than 3 times the poverty line. So the minimum wage is a very inefficient tool to help low-income families below the poverty line. And it may result in significant employment losses among the very population minimum wage advocates are trying to help. So we should celebrate that some firms are raising wages. Presumably these increases are in the best interest of the firms and in the best interest of the economy at large, and they clearly help the workers. But we should recognize that mandatory increases are very different than voluntary increases, and that mandatory increases very likely could carry unintended consequences. My third point is that despite that gloom and doom I just delivered, we shouldn't do nothing. I think that there is an appropriate public policy response at the federal level to the situation that low-wage workers find themselves in, and that is to increase the Earned Income Tax Credit. The EITC is a federal earnings subsidy. The basic idea is simple. If you work and if your household earns below a certain amount, then the government writes you a check. The EITC is very efficient because it is targeted at households with low income rather than at workers with low wages. And those are very, very different populations, as is suggested by the CBO's distributional analysis as to which households would get how much of that $31 billion increase in earnings. Previous EITC expansions have pulled significant numbers of jobless Americans into the workforce, and the EITC lifts millions of people, including millions of children, out of poverty. So to take a step back, we should have as a goal that no one who works full-time and heads a household lives in poverty. That is a social goal, and consequently, that goal should be met with social resources. Proponents of involuntary legislated minimum wages implicitly argue that the burden of meeting that goal should be placed on the shoulders of the businesses who employ low-wage workers and on the customers of those businesses who will see higher prices. The EITC is better than this. It marshals resources from all of society to help meet that social goal. Instead of a few businesses, the EICT supports work, encourages earned success, and fights poverty using resources from McDonald's and Walmart and Target, sure, but also from well-to-do economists, from Wall Street financiers, from corporate CEOs, and from hedge fund managers. All of society should be employed to achieve that noble social goal. The EITC is designed to make that happen. It is a superior tool to the federal minimum wage. And I will leave it at that.
Well, good morning. Let me begin by saying that I'm going to shock you and say that I can agree with all of the people who've come before me that raising low-wage workers' pay is a good idea. And I find myself a little surprised to be amidst such a robust and passionate consensus. This is, I think, the first time in which I've been at the Peterson Institute for a moment at which everyone, including my friends from the American Enterprise Institute, all embraced the AFL-CIO's current strategic campaign, which is called Raising Wages. And I welcome all of you to it. Now, I think there's a set of things that have to be said about this, though, to make sense of some of the back and forth around the areas where maybe there wasn't so much consensus. The first is that we really misconceive what's going on in America's labor market and in America's broader economy when we talk about the issue we're dealing with today as an issue of poverty. There's no question it is an issue of poverty, and just to be clear about this, because I suspect none of us in this room, or very few of us in this room, work for an hourly wage, we are talking about a current minimum wage that full-time is roughly $14,500 a year, depending on how long you get paid, and that how long you work, and that a $10 an hour minimum wage is roughly $20,000 a year. Before you get too outraged at the possibility that somebody might be paid that much money that doesn't deserve it, spend a moment thinking about how your life would work if that was what you were paid. So poverty is important here because what I'm describing is wage levels in which people live in poverty. Whether they live in poverty according to the indexes we keep officially is not really the issue. They experience, at any of these wage levels, people who depend on them experience a life of poverty. But the reason why it's not the issue is because those dynamics and those wage levels, that level of the minimum wage, large firms of the kind that we've been discussing here paying those wage levels are an embedded part of a larger problem, which is wage stagnation across the entire labor market, up to roughly the 90th percentile over the period of decades. In that environment, right, our economy has all sorts of problems. Right? What was referred to in Adam Posen's introduction to the papers this morning, the Fordist fantasy. It is a fantasy when you look at it from the perspective of very low-wage workers whose incomes are so low that even when you're talking about millions of people, and the kinds of wage increases we're discussing today don't have a macroeconomic effect. But long-term wage stagnation across what amounts to the entire labor market does. And so when we talk about policy solutions, we have to ask ourselves, what is the impact on this larger problem? In addition to asking the question that I think Michael put in front of us, which is what is the most effective way to increase the incomes of the poor? Now, here are a couple of basic observations that I will make, and then I assume we're going to have a group discussion. The first is the question of what our minimum wage should be, right, is obviously embedded in the question of the pay increases that have been made. And I love the term that Jakob used, was it voluntary wage increases, or self-actuated wage increases by large companies. I'm going to come back to that in a second. Because that really does a disservice to the people who work for those companies, and I will speak to that in a moment. But just talk about the minimum wage for a moment. The minimum wage today is roughly 35% of the average hourly wage. At its peak in the late 1960s, it was 53%. If the one major problem that is associated with arguments about the impact of raising the minimum wage on low-wage employment is the issue of wage compression. It's what drives the numbers that Michael was talking about. Whether or not you agree with those numbers, and I would suggest that, as Michael sort of hinted, the bulk of labor market academia is a little more optimistic about raising the minimum wage than CBO is. But the point is, it's all driven by compression. And compression is about wage stagnation across the labor market. Right? So that if we're trying to think seriously about how to raise the wages of the poor, we ought to think seriously about how to reverse the shift from returns on wages from returns on capital to returns on wages that are outlined in the papers you have more broadly. But if we wanted to return to historical levels of the minimum wage, just looking at the effects of inflation, we would be talking about a minimum wage at around $11 an hour today. Not years from now, but today. All right. The second point I'll make is this issue of voluntary wage increases. Walmart, which is the first firm to have announced wage increases for its employees, that got a lot of attention. Walmart is the country's largest private sector employer. Walmart's employees have been engaged in a multi-year effort to get Walmart to raise their wages. They've gone on strike, they've picketed Walmart, they've engaged in all the things that historically are associated with collective bargaining, but they've done so without an exclusive bargaining relationship with the company. McDonald's workers, which is the latest announcement, have done the same thing, as have the employees of many other fast food companies. April 15th is the day on which workers at a wide range of employers, including particularly McDonald's, intend to go through another round of strikes and protests demanding, as Michael alluded to, $15 an hour and a union. Again, they're engaging in collective bargaining, but they're not doing it within the National Labor Relations Board structures. Although in both cases, Walmart workers and McDonald's workers have been pursuing their legal remedies at the National Labor Relations Board, particularly when those firms have illegally retaliated against them for exercising their right to collective action by firing them. Both of these companies are enmeshed in heavy-duty social conflict. Right? What they are doing is they're engaging in collective bargaining too, and they're making offers to their employees. The clear subtext of the offers is, please be quiet and go away. On April 15th, we'll see what McDonald's workers think of that offer. The fascinating thing about it, which relates to Justin's question about, shouldn't we be able to run an experiment, is that McDonald's offer to raise its wages by $1 an hour, from $7.25 is the lowest up to $8.25. McDonald's offer has been made only to the 90,000 McDonald's employees who work directly for McDonald's corporate, meaning McDonald's itself owns a bunch of McDonald's restaurants, but it's a small portion of the overall McDonald's in the country. Most McDonald's are owned through the franchise system, and they have not been guaranteed that wage increase. So I suspect we'll be seeing a bit of that experiment in the weeks to come, at least in McDonald's. But the main thing to understand here is that what is going on at McDonald's and at Walmart and at the other fast food companies is collective bargaining. It's just collective bargaining in the street, meaning instead of sitting down at a table and negotiating, people are yelling at each other through megaphones. Workers use literal megaphones, and the employer uses all the apparatus that are available to a large, well-resourced corporation to make its offers. Now, if we think that that is a better way to raise wages, and it seems as though there's some consensus in this room that it is, that is a better way to raise wages than the minimum wage, we ought to first ask ourselves, I think there's not disagreement in this room, maybe there is, Michael will have to explain later, but I think there's not disagreement in this room that we ought to have a minimum wage. And if we ought to have a minimum wage, the question of where it should be set would seem to be higher than where it is now, which is at a historic low in relationship to the rest of the labor market. But there's a really good argument that a minimum wage is not good enough as a way of dealing with the problem of wage stagnation across the labor market, including in relatively low-wage work like fast food and Walmart, where there are powerful arguments, if you look at those firms, that they ought to be paying well above the minimum wage. Right? They are not a pretzel stand. But the question is how. And if you believe that what is going on right now in the street, so to speak, collective bargaining by Walmart and McDonald's workers with Walmart and McDonald's management, if you think that that's the right way to do it, then you ought to ask yourself, how do you sustain that and broaden it? Because the reality is, right, that, and there's no secret about this, the reality is that those workers are being supported by other workers who are part of the old collective bargaining system that is done through the National Labor Relations Act, through exclusive representation, through paying union dues, and the like. And if you want to have a labor market in which there is, in fact, a robust system of collective bargaining, and all issues do not become essentially issues of public policy, right? So that there's some room for customization in firms, then you have to actually have one. And something we don't talk about very much here, but which ought to be said, is that wage stagnation in the United States is directly correlated with the dismantling of the collective bargaining system, particularly in the private sector, in a way that is not true in other OECD countries. And so I would suggest to you two things. One is, to the extent that we all agree that it's good for low-wage workers to enjoy wage increases, and I suspect we all agree that it's good for workers as a whole to enjoy wage increases commensurate with their growing productivity, then the question is not should we have a minimum wage, but where should it be? And I'm afraid there's no way to get around it. It needs to be higher than where it is now in order for it to simply do its job, A. And B, we need to think really carefully about how in today's economy, in today's labor market, in today's globalized world, how do we ensure that the interaction that is going on between Walmart's workers and McDonald's workers and Walmart management and McDonald's management, which is leading to their wages being increased after years of stagnation and, in fact, at Walmart really falling compensation, if we think that interaction is a good thing, how do we ensure that the workers who are engaged in it are not doing so at the risk of their jobs, which is the reality of what's going on now? And it's why the National Labor Relations Board has brought charges against Walmart for firing workers who are engaging in this process we all like so much. We ought to ask ourselves, how do we ensure that that process is routinized? And routinized in a world of networked firms and franchises and precarious work. Because really, if that's what we say we want, that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Could I ask our four panelists to come up? I'm going to make a couple remarks to try to pull this together. Just for those of you tuning in on webcast or on C-SPAN and coming in later, just a reminder that all of today's remarks and the luncheon speech by Mark Bertolini, CEO of Aetna, will all be available on the website. Transcripts will go up shortly afterwards, and our briefing and various other supplementary materials will be available on the same web page on www.piie.com. Before I let my happy warriors go at it, let me just make a couple points. The first is factual on this word voluntary. I normally don't want to get into facts with Damon because he usually gets them right. But on this one, Aetna raised wages more than a month before Walmart, and did so with no strike threat. So, and again, they were not the only ones, but they were the big ones starting it this year, which is why we bothered to have Bertolini come. But more importantly, I think what I asked all our panelists, and I particularly asked our outside guests, to talk about how this relates to the minimum wage. So I think it was right to go there. But I want to also stress what we're talking about in terms of the so-called voluntary low-wage sector, or voluntary raises for a low-wage sector. A large share of people at the minimum wage are people who are young or part-time or who have low attachment to work. And there are reasons, and I personally am in favor of a large minimum wage hike, there are reasons why you might want to do that. But I think it is reasonable to think about the millions of people who are one stage up, the sort of classic working class, who are in jobs that maybe are slightly less precarious, we hope, and have the potential to be long-term, if not permanent jobs, and who are full-time workers and who are often heads of household. And the issue is whether or not there is an economic case to be made, as well as a business case, as well as a PR case. We're here for the economic case, that companies should be investing more in that set of workers. So instead of the Goldman Sachs and the Citigroup investing huge amounts of money in the people at what is putatively the high-skilled end of the distribution, whether it makes sense for private sector to invest in the people at what's putatively the low-skilled end of the distribution. And as I think Jacob and Justin put implicitly, and is documented in pretty good detail by Thomas Hellebrandt in our briefings that are out today, this is not a huge share of the workforce, but it's a larger share than the minimum wage workforce. And it is not something that every company is going to do. Go back to McDonald's. We can be upset with a McDonald's or any other fast food joint because they run on a very low-wage model. And we can ask ourselves whether, that's a sustainable model, whether we want to legislate about that. But the issue is there is a broad range of companies in this country who input isn't solely low-wage labor. And that's what we've tried to identify, not specific companies, but sectors, types of firms, where it could be broadly sensible to invest in that, because it's not like you're an individual cleaning service or an individual McDonald's franchise where you move your labor input, that takes away your profit margin. And I think that's part of the question we have to think about, is how realistic is that? And we would argue, I think, that that's realistic for a large part of companies. The second point I want to make before turning to our panel is just bring us back to the international context, which Jacob did in part, and he has a great essay and set of comparisons again in our new briefing. It is very important to put the kinds of things that Michael cited from the CBO in context. When we talk about the CBO saying there would be X 100,000 work jobs lost, three cautions. First, that's not dynamic scoring. We talk a lot about dynamic scoring on the fiscal side. That's also a straight partial equilibrium result about and I know Michael knows this, I just want to be clear for the audience. It's about what is the immediate impact. It's not about if there are the kinds of productivity effects that Justin was talking about and that plays out in the economy and you reallocate workers. Potentially, that's not what we're talking about. The second point is a couple 100,000, 500,000 people are a lot of human beings. We should care about that. But the US workforce is 150 plus million human beings, and we churn 5 million jobs a month. So when we're talking about an effect that is something below 1 million, whether you're talking about that as the effect of a trade deal or whether you're talking about that as the effect of a wage increase, human beings are never rounding error, but from a policy point of view, getting caught up in something that's tenths of a percent of total employment is not necessarily the way you want to evaluate a policy like raising the minimum wage. And again, I know Michael wasn't saying that, but I just have to get some context there. But the final point, in terms of the internationalization, which Jacob didn't have a chance to say, is that we know cross-sectionally across countries, and Damon sort of touched on this. He emphasized the collective bargaining. We'll emphasize the outcomes. That there are a vast majority, not just of European countries, including Justin's native Australia, including some of the Asian and richer Latin American countries, where the wage gap is much smaller. And they manage to export, and they manage to have relatively high labor force participation. Jacob's done some very good work in the last few months on the fact that labor force participation has actually gone up in Western Europe, even in countries where wages were not horribly compressed, including Germany. It is not this iron law that if you pay more, you cease to compete. Doesn't mean it always pays, but it might. So with that in mind, or more importantly, what our panelists had in mind, let me open up to the floor for any questions or comments. Jessica has a mic up front. Please, these two people, first to Nancy and then to this gentleman. Please identify yourself. Please, if you're going to make a political statement, pretend it's a question. Sorry.
Hi, Adam. It's Nancy Donaldson with the ILO. And first, I just want to thank the Peterson Institute for organizing this briefing and this meeting and for looking at these issues. One of the issues I was hoping to hear from the panelists maybe a little more, and I missed just the very beginning, but when Michael was talking about public policy effects, let me just say, of course, I think EITC is one of the best programs going. But I was hoping that some of the analysis from the economists would look at the remarkable amount of taxpayer subsidy that goes in effect to companies that have low-wage workers because of the public services that those low-wage workers have to access to live. And it's so, I saw just one study about workers in Ohio, and it was tens of thousands of workers who were relying on public welfare systems because as full-time low-wage workers. So they imagine how that effect spreads in the United States. And I just wonder if anyone could speak to that, because it's a really important public policy issue.
Yep. Anyone on the panel care to speak? Could you hit the button?
I can take a quick stab at that. That's basically a political question. And I say it in the sense that it really depends on what your baseline is. So you can say all these guys at Walmart who work at Walmart are on food stamps. And if they weren't on food stamps, if they weren't being paid a low wage, they wouldn't be on food stamps. So therefore implicitly we're subsidizing the hell out of Walmart. A different baseline is Walmart's response will be if they weren't working at Walmart on a low wage, they wouldn't be working at all. The food stamp subsidy would be even bigger. So in fact, Walmart's helping the fisc. So it's a question of what the right baseline here is. And of course, this is just a question, I think, very much more of political framing than anything else. I do think there's an important public policy issue here. The way I describe it is, if you believe that there really are two profitable wage policies, there's the high road and the low road. We as a democratic population might think we prefer firms to take the high road. When firms are doing bad things, polluting the river and the like, the economist's answer is you tax people doing bad things and you get them to do good things. And so if you really think that there are two profitable alternatives for businesses and the businesses that are taking the low road are just making us all worse off, then I think there's a strong argument that we should either tax those guys for making bad choices or subsidize the other guys for making good choices.
I think, look, there have been a lot of studies of what those costs look like. and the singular fact that Walmart, which is at various times the company with the largest capitalization, or one of the largest capitalizations on our securities markets, is also the company that employs the most people on Medicaid. Right? That sort of thing has been looked at a lot. I think Justin's answer really draws out something very important to understand, though, about this. It's that if you postulate, right, a country, a political economy, a country in which the choices are unemployment or low-wage work for billionaires subsidized by the public, right, then you end up making very bad choices no matter what you do. And let me spell out what I mean. In the economy that we have actually built, right, the Walton family, I've run these numbers in this way, so I haven't decomposed it but the Walton family, the 6 of them, and the Koch brothers, who were some other very wealthy people involved in our politics, have a net worth collectively of $230 billion. That is equal to the net worth of 44% of our population. The subsidies you're talking about, right, have produced that outcome. Now, they are not the only thing that have produced it, but they have fed that outcome. Now, if you want, you could hypothesize that somehow the politics that those numbers drive are going to produce the kinds of results, right, that Justin hopes for, which is that we will tax low-road employers to make up the difference. That would be a response. History and comparative political economy suggest that if you want a different response, the people who work for these companies have to have some voice in our political economy. Right? That's, I think, the proposition to which the ILO is dedicated to. Right? We are beginning to see right now, in fact, we're having this meeting because, and I mean no offense to the folks at Aetna, who I recognize are in a different place, a different situation. But we are having this discussion because low-wage workers at fast food, in the fast food sector and at Walmart, have braved being fired in order to try to raise the wages of themselves and their coworkers. That's the only way you get out of the trap that Justin's analysis hypothesizes. And I think you have to ask the question about public policy measures, be they the minimum wage, the EITC, the labor and employment laws. You have to ask the question, are they promoting a high-wage society or a low-wage society? And we don't seem to like a low-wage society, but we've consciously built one, and we need to make different choices if we want a different one.
Michael, did you want to come in? Or
yeah,
Justin will come
I'll be
back.
very brief. I agree with Justin that it's a political question, and I think we have to think about it from the broad 30,000-foot level of society, and we have to recognize that different agents in society have different responsibilities. And so imagine you have workers, firms, and a government. It is, in some sense, Damon is arguing that we've built this low-wage system, but if you're talking about fast food industries, fast food restaurants, and low-wage workers, it is simply unrealistic to expect that a firm that is ostensibly trying to maximize profits, although perhaps imperfectly, will take someone who can bring in $5 or $7 an hour in revenue and pay them 2 to 3 times that amount of money. They will be losing $5 or $10 an hour on every hour that person is working, and that is just unrealistic to expect a firm to do in a market economy. And so then the question becomes, who is responsible for making sure that the employees of these organizations have adequate food, adequate shelter, adequate health care, and who can meet a baseline level of material standing, especially given that we live in a society where we have a lot of billionaires, as Damon pointed out. And to me, that answer is government through all of society. And so I don't want those workers to be poor, and I don't want those workers to not have enough food, and I don't want those workers to have to deal with the cognitive load that Justin described. But I want more than McDonald's and more than Walmart to be responsible for making sure that those outcomes happen. I want the Koch brothers to be responsible. I want the Walton family to be responsible. I want me to be responsible, even though I don't employ any low-wage workers. And so the way to do that is to tax people who have a lot of money and to redistribute it to people who are working hard and playing by the rules, but who aren't earning what we deem socially as an adequate standard of living. So you seem to want Walmart and McDonald's to bear the entire brunt of that, and that's implicit in the argument that somehow the government is subsidizing Walmart and McDonald's, and I just fundamentally disagree with that framing.
Okay, Jacob and Justin.
No, just very quickly. I mean, if you take the big one, which I would argue is the healthcare issue, right? I mean, the fact that the United States is virtually unique, in fact, in essence, unique among the industrialized world in having this direct employment link, typically to healthcare. I mean, if you take other countries where you have essentially a single-payer public funded system, the logic you could then say, well, on the one hand, that implies that the subsidy provided by the public sector to the entire corporate world is 100%, right? Because no firms needs to take any direct cost for healthcare. It's just basically taken care of, if you like. But of course, and from the corporate's perspective, that is, I would argue, certainly any person, any corporate executive that I have spoken to would be a much, maybe not people that provide this kind of service, but from if you're a foreign direct investor or something like that, would you rather invest in a country where you have to deal with this issue, or if it's just basically taken care of by the government? I would certainly argue that it is the latter. And therefore, I think in an international context, at least, I think it is probably the wrong framing of this as viewing it as a public subsidy to the corporate sector. Rather, I think you should take both a normative position and say, look, this is actually one of the social goals that society wants to promote, which is true in pretty much all other industrialized economies. But you should also take an efficiency perspective to this. It really is hard to argue that there are any efficiency gains to be had in having the broad healthcare system that the United States has when we compare the cost of it with other industrialized countries.
Justin.
So all of my discussions with Michael Strain and the rest of his cabal of long-haired liberals end with him suggesting that we should always only take action through the state and absolve any one of individual responsibility. The alternative, of course, is to recognise the possibility that sometimes it's just the right thing to do. And corporate social responsibility is more than just a buzzword, but actually something that we should take seriously. And that then suggests that we should think a little bit more than just the marginal product of the worker at McDonald's relative to their wage, and ask a little bit more sometimes. And I think one of the tools that I wish Damon and his colleagues would use more that's been lost is actually what you'd think of as being the shame constraint. So we have low-wage workers in precarious work working for billionaires, but billionaires who take their helicopter straight from Manhattan to the Hamptons and as a result never touch anyone along the way. And there was a time when we thought that, when we asked a little bit more of chief executive officers and firms, and that shame constraint's no longer there. And I think that's a large part of what we're seeing driving the income distribution now. And I think the shame constraint, to the extent to which we can bring it back, is actually a way to push CEOs to take the high road. Damon's usually thinking about how to force them to do it, but sometimes we can entice them to do it instead.
I'm not sure the AFL, however, wants to suggest that they've been lackadaisical on the shame front.
I was going to say, I'm feeling kind of like I've been shirking.
I'm also not sure Wolfer should be talking about hair length.
Let me pick up on something Justin said. I know the gentleman here is waiting and gentleman in the back, but this is a very important discussion. So let me pick up on something Justin said and take it a slightly different direction. I mean, there's the issue of, do we do things just through the state or not? And there is a very coherent political economy moral argument of the sort that Michael's making. I think, though, I want to make a practical argument, which I think will be echoed to some degree by Mark later. For many people in capitalist societies, work is an important part of their life. And how you're treated at work and in your work day is an important part of your life. And I don't think any of us are going to deny this. And so the idea that we target things, be it the EITC and the minimum wage, again, both of which I support. Okay, let me be very clear. Happy to support those. But those are about achieving post-work income outcomes. And they're about making sure that there is a floor, both of which are virtuous. But there's something to be said for making in-work outcomes better for the vast majority of people. And that's a distinct part of life and is a goal worth pursuing, and that may not be legislatable. There may be collective business action inspired by the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the example of Aetna, or perhaps pressured through changes in the world. But either way, there may be room to go the high road, as Justin says, and it's not just about how much money you get home at the end of the day, it's about how you're treated in the workplace. And I think that's a part that shouldn't get lost when we talk about this. Very patient. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Jonathan Pingel. I used to be a labor economist. And my question is for Justin, Jacob, and Michael, a little bit, how we got where we are. So when we think about the prevalence of low wages, a low-wage society, all of which is related to the very low share of labor income as a share of national income, Damon lays out a sort of a case for why we've gotten where we are, which is some fundamental change in, workers negotiating in the wage bargain, right? I mean, he's talking about a lack of unionization and a substantial amount of bargaining going on outside what you would consider normal NLRB bargaining, which is, kind of an important starting point for thinking about how to solve the problem is where we are today. I mean, Justin's laid out we've got sort of two equilibriums and we're stuck in the suboptimal one. But I'm curious what he thinks, why are we stuck in the suboptimal one? And does it really need to be, how do we get out of it? And I'd also curious what Jacob and Michael think about it. This is essentially a long-running theme in the labor literature from, the declining job opportunities of older men that was, started to take traction in the 80s. And we've essentially just seen labor share of national income drift lower for several decades, even with the very tight, robust labor market of the 1990s and what was also relatively low unemployment in the 2000s. That failed to arrest it too, which makes you wonder how able we are as a society or a market economy to do it now.
Yeah. Before my colleagues respond, just another plug for our briefing. In the last essay, which Justin did, we have figure 9. I should have this up on PowerPoint, sorry, it will be on the website. But you do see the downward trend that Jonathan just mentioned, but then an incredible acceleration in the downward trend of labor share over recent years. And so there's both pieces to it, and that's part of the reason why the whole cyclical argument that things are tightening up can only be a partial explanation. But anyway, would anyone care to respond?
I can take a quick swing at it. I think descriptively, you've seen changes in labor supply and labor demand. On the labor demand front, due primarily to automation and technology and what economists would call the routinization of tasks. You've seen a decrease in demand for certain types of workers and firms pushing workers into the lower wage portion of their occupational structure and away from the middle wage portion. I think globalization has also played a big role in keeping wages down, and I think economists are starting to recognize that the role of globalization is actually greater than many had previously thought. So those, I think, are the two big ones there. On the labor supply front, for men, you've seen a slowing growth in the acquisition of skills, and so the college, high school wage gap is affected by that. I think, kind of bringing it back to what Justin said, to the previous question, is also important. It's that firms don't invest in workers the way they used to invest in them. And part of that is firms reacting to the fact that workers are much more mobile, they hold many more jobs over the course of their career than they used to, and this kind of implicit, non-legislated employment contract has frayed. And part of it, I think, is a relentless focus on hitting quarterly numbers that didn't used to be the case decades ago, and firms trying to cut costs by cutting worker training, which in turn makes workers feel less appreciated and less likely to stay. So I think that part of the answer to your question is that we need to ask more of firms, and I agree with Justin and I agree with Adam that we tend to let firms off the hook, especially people in my camp. and that firms need to have a better attitude of social responsibility and recognize that they're part of a society. And a big part of that is training. And public policy can make some nudges in that area. And I think a really promising avenue is apprenticeships, where the government, will, arrange a marriage between, or not, perhaps a community college, so, not necessarily the labor department, will arrange a marriage between someone trying to pursue an academic credential and a firm that wants an apprentice. You'd have to pay him a lot less than $10 an hour to make this work. But trying to find ways to nudge firms back into offering training opportunities and being better social citizens than they have been, I think is part of the solution to the problem you point out.
Jacob, you've done some work for us on the apprenticeships issue that Michael's raised. Do you want to say anything on this?
No, I mean, I think one of the, I think I agree with a lot of what Michael said there, and I think I really do want to highlight, though, the perhaps unique issue that, or not unique, but certainly I would argue more prevalent in the United States than in many other advanced economies, which is the role of educational expenditures, which, while in the aggregate is quite high in the United States, that actually masks a remarkable, distributional effect there as well, where everyone knows the cost of going to a top college and a top private school, et cetera, and factor that in with the very meager funding from many community colleges and many the type of apprenticeships program that Michael mentioned. So there is I don't know if you can call it redistributional issue involved there, but I think it's a very important issue, and I think it becomes even more important when we start talking about the effects of the minimum wage, because I come from Denmark, where there is no minimum wage, but de facto there is. Enforced by, essentially a consensus norm. That means that the de facto minimum wage is about $20 an hour. Yet, and the problem, you cannot, I would argue, have a system like that doesn't produce a large-scale inactivity unless you have very large expenditures on education. And that is not just education at the college level. It is actually a lot more expenditure at the, to the 50 to 2/3 of people that do not get a college degree or above. That's essentially the essence of what does flexicurity mean. It means flexibility, but it also means a lot of expenditure there. And I certainly think that the lack thereof and the significant cutbacks in the last couple of years in the United States is a very aggravating factor in this issue.
Do you want to say something? Go.
But the questioner asked the three of them. I don't want to.
No. You can talk.
All right.
Justin
agrees with Michael. All right.
But a little short, because we've got to make.
Yeah, no. I just observed three facts. I think we tell ourselves pretty stories in order not to talk about the actual determinants of what makes wages low or high, which is questions of bargaining power. And although I very much agree with what Jacob said, I think it's really important to note three things here. First is, actually, worker mobility is down. There's a whole labor economics agenda around why it's down, but worker mobility is down since the 1970s. It's not an explanation for why corporations aren't investing in training. Michael's second point about financialization, essentially, and short-termism is more of a response. But the real response is the collapse of collective bargaining in the private sector. 9 out of 10, maybe 19 out of 20 apprentices in this country are apprentices in joint labor movement employer apprenticeship programs, largely in the building trades. And in Denmark, the social consensus that Jacob is talking about is very real, but it's not some vague thing in the air. Something like 70-80% of the Danish workforce is covered by a collective bargaining agreement. It's a social consensus that's enforced. And it's part of a system that's designed to produce a high-wage economy. And that type of educational spending is critical to that system. By contrast, as Jacob points out, but I'll put a sharper point on it, We have 250,000 less teachers than we should have based upon pupil-teacher ratios as they stood in 2007. That's what we're actually doing. We are accelerating ourselves toward a lower and lower wage economy.
Okay. You've been very patient at the back, but this will have to be the last question for this session.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. Would the panel address the question of immigration and its impact on wages? My own sense is, in talking to employers across the country, is that a ready pool of largely non-English speaking unskilled labor has put downward pressure on wages in the construction, fast food, certainly law and services industries.
Somebody want to summarize the literature real fast?
Well, there was a boat lift in Mariel. That's all I have to say.
Go ahead, Jacob.
No, I think most of my work focuses on the high-skilled immigration issue, where I think it's fair to say that by and large the wage effects are relatively subdued. If I haven't found much persuasive evidence there, but I think on lower-skilled workers, I think that there is quite a bit of evidence that the fact that you have, and this is by the way an effect you find in a number of other countries, notably in Europe, that if you have, even if they don't even need to be in the country, in fact, but if you have a latent migratory workforce available as a corporation, then there are downward pressures on wages for these types, for some low-skilled workers, in the agricultural sector, in the construction sector. If you take a country like the UK, for instance, where you have not a large illegal immigration pool of workers, but you have a lot, under the EU freedom of movement, you have a large population of workers typically from Eastern Europe that can come at very short notice, that are basically available, quote unquote, on demand. And there are, I think, pretty compelling evidence from the UK and elsewhere in Europe, Germany, elsewhere, that this does have an effect. And I think some of the same issues work when the low-skilled workforce is actually present in the country in illegal form. The issue here is availability for the firm.
Yeah.
Can I just say, when the AFL-CIO is a strong supporter of comprehensive immigration reform with a path to citizenship, and we believe that is a moral issue, but we also have that position because we think that, taking into account what Jacob is saying, that the worst possible thing you can do in terms of wage levels in the United States is pretend that you have closed borders, but then essentially have in a sort of subterfuge, actual open borders. But when the people get here, we treat them as a second caste who have no legal rights. That from the perspective of like, what would you think would be the worst possible way to do this in terms of downward wage pressure? That would be it, and that is what our members experience, both documented and undocumented. That's what our members experience in the workplace.
We're coming to the end of this panel. I'll get to the logistics of how you get fed in a moment. I want to bring back one thing that was talked about, particularly in Justin's opening remarks, but in everybody's remarks, but I think has gotten lost in the period of the questions, which is the key word is productivity. It's the key word, I think, in three senses. The first is, when we're talking about investing in workers, it's just as with investing in capital goods or investing in infrastructure. The issue isn't simply you invest in workers to accumulate more hours. You invest in workers to get more out of them. And that this is the point of the sort of dynamic view you have to take of these things. That it's not a comparative statics thing. You have to think about that, which goes to the good and bad equilibria question about Justin. This is that Justin raises. It's about transitioning from one to the other, and as we saw in the US in the 1990s, it is possible to move from one productivity equilibrium to another, or now back. The second point about productivity, which goes to something that Jacob and Damon just said in regard to immigration, is we know that this is, again, it's like with trade, it's immigration, it's with jobs. The issue is balancing the adjustment costs of moving people in markets to the longer run growth benefits of having more efficient markets. And that doesn't mean always that more is always better, but it means that preventing competition and is always worse. So you have to figure out how to get around this, and that's the struggle where all of us in good faith are trying to figure out where the right point is on this issue. The final thing, before we turn to lunch and then to Mark Bertolini's speech, is that we are in a world, and I don't want to come down on the politics because I don't know enough, but we're in a world where the reality is unionization in the US is very low across a large range of industries. And my tendency, my gut feeling is a lot of that has to do with political choices that were made about who got elected to Congress and to the presidency and things they did. And so in that context, it's for those of us who care deeply about the distribution of wages, one thing you can talk about is giving more power back to unions. Another thing you can talk about is, well, that doesn't seem to be happening at the moment. Do we have another avenue? And there again is where the productivity comes in, because that's how you bribe a corporation, in a sense, into doing the right thing. Anyway, thank you all very much for joining us this morning. We will reconvene in 15 minutes at 12:15 for an address by Mark Bertolini, the CEO of Aetna, a member of the Institute's board. Lunch is available for those of you who are here in reality. Those of you on the web and on C-SPAN have to go feed yourselves. And just another round of thank you to our colleagues, Justin, Jacob, Michael, and Damon, who did a great job today. Thank you very much.